Not all the time, but y'all have moments of clarity too, right? So when you say this, now it pushes us to think about this differently. And if we think about it differently, what will we do to address it? And I'm arguing that these folks who have engaged in these Black fugitive futures, they've begun to think about it, right? It's not these one-off solutions, but they're now starting to think about this in a very different way. But now when we look at, and I would encourage folks, please read the work of Eve Ewing. Her book goes in the schoolyard. And there's something that she said, she and I are good friends, so we always crack this joke. I am going to find some way to put what she wrote about in my book, if I haven't finished the damn thing. Eve has the most succinct way of understanding school closings. She refers to it as the morning of home. Right? So school closings are literally how people force people to mourn home or the loss of home. And she refers to it as an institutional mourning. So when we now mourn these institutions, what is the result? And in the mourning of those institutions, now what is left? And how is this emblematic of a perpetual attack on Black bodies since Black bodies arrived in Chicago en masse in the early 20th century? So now we're asking a different set of questions. Provocative, but in the same light, I say this to you all as a Chicagoan because you see this and you live these things, but it's a different thing to articulate them in a different way. So as we start to articulate this, right, and the Chicagoans, we're hella provincial, right? So, you know, we got this whole thing like Chicago's like Chicago versus the world. Like everywhere you go, you know, it's like, look, I just want y'all to know somebody from Chicago was here. If y'all ever think about it anyway, just know that Chicago was here, right? So this thing around, so Eve Ewing, she actually was on the Daily Show. She walks out, 3 people yell, "Chi-Town, what's up, girl?" And Trevor Noah was like, "I see you bring a grouping of people." It's like, it's a Chicago thing. We always got to know where we at. Right? So this thing around, because what that really is a commentary around hypersegregation. Right? It's really around you always knowing where you're at, because at any given moment, it could mean you harm. Right? And I still engage in this sometimes when I go to Bridgeport. But I still, as a Chicagoan, go to Bridgeport and still have these responses, right? And now, over half of Bridgeport is Chinese and Mexican, right? And I'm looking around like, oh, right? Because Bridgeport had this thing. Bridgeport had a set of public housing units called the Bridgeport Homes. That was one of the only all-white public housing units in the country outside of Boston. Now, Boston South is a whole different thing. Like, I had never seen that. I was like, dang, this is poor white folks in the middle of a city. Right? But this thing around Bridgeport had an element of that, but it shifted drastically. Right? And now, and I was workshopping this with a group of sociologists, and someone said that this is an interesting thing, because they were also saying that white populations, working class white populations, get affected by this in Chicago because they're also being gentrified. Bridgeport is different. And if you're a real Chicagoan, you know the community next to it that you call Bridgeport, but it's really called Canaryville. Right? That's just, my uncle said, that's real Chicago knowledge. Like, when Chicagoan refers to their neighborhood by its neighborhood name, they live there. For real. Right? But also what we do in Chicago by way of gentrification, we try to change up names. Give you all an example. How many of y'all have heard of Pilsen Heights? Yeah. It's the east side of Pilsen. Right? Realtors call it the Heights. Right? And folks are like, what are we doing? Right? So this changing, and look, they're even trying to build a new neighborhood space called the 78. See, they're trying to slip that one in. They just want to distract you with Lincoln Yards. Right? The distraction is Lincoln Yards, but the real piece is that Chicago's trying to build, annex another space. Right? That's riverfront property. Right? And one of the markers, and when we start to map this out, one of the markers for neighborhood change and what urban planners refer to as uneven development is the access to rail. So when we look at the access to rail, now we can also locate shifting in schools, shifting in the housing market. Some of you all are very familiar with Logan Square. The California and Milwaukee stop is a new reality. 6 years ago, you could play football on the California and Milwaukee stop. Now, at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, you got hella people. 4,000 people came to one corner in the span of 3 years. My next question is, what's happened with the police presence? And what do the schools look like? So now, what we're talking about is not just cartography of these particular instantiations, but what we're really talking about is the way in which a city has engineered cleansing itself of the people determined to be the error. So now a bigger question, right? Who's working to interrupt that, right? And this will not make me a popular person. That's not the point. The issue is when we can talk about these realities in ways that make sense and also disturb the narrative of positive development. Right? Because the city is priding itself on development. Right? We got all these signs, building a new Chicago. They used to let us in on the secret. Because what this is really part of is the Chicago 21 plan that was written in 1971. Now, they used to have it, and this is when, so Pauline, me and Pauline Littman, who's a dear friend of mine, a colleague, we often crack this joke. I was like, Pauline, so you let everybody in, and then they changed it up. So now the signs say building a new Chicago. Back in the day, the signs used to say neighborhoods alive, and they had a 21. Some folks remember those signs. Right? So that 21 was naming the 21 wards that were identified for redevelopment. And if we look at the mapping of new home construction, skyscraper development, it's the same wards named in that 21 plan. Almost 50 years ago. So now when we look at this particular sets of development, we ask this different question. And with the Chicago 21 plan, they had some interesting language in there, right? And you see how public policy is written with the hope that no one reads it. So in the Chicago 21 plan, they say, we want to return the original inhabitants to these wards. They are not talking about the Ohio, Potawatomi, Oneida. That is not in there. That is not in their lexicon. What they're talking about is returning white folks who went to the burbs. Right? In explicit language. So now Chicago has shifted itself to a center city model, where the poorer you are, the further you are away from the city center. The more money you have, the closer you are to the city center. And this is a European model of cities, right? So even if you go to Canada, so Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, they're all constructed in this way, but it's after European cities. And now we're seeing cities in the States, like New York, like Miami, like Los Angeles, like Chicago, that are now centered around this center city model, right? So as poor folks get pushed out, this wealth disparity comes clear. And a very interesting thing, Chicago has one of the highest GDPs of cities in the world. And it's largely because of this disparity, and more importantly, where that concentration of wealth is located. 90% of it is located north of Cermak. So now when we start to look at this, these particular geographic arrangements now beg a different question, right? Let me check in with y'all. This is making sense. Right. So I'll end with this point. Engineered conflict is not a theorization around a conspiracy. Engineered conflict is a theorization around ethnic cleansing. And now we have to look at who has been deemed the population to be cleansed. And I don't say that lightly, because I understand in struggles across the planet, there are communities like the Rohingya, like the Yemeni, like folks in Syria, who are literally being cleansed from spaces. And I want to think about the severity of what's happening here in Chicago as parallel to those relationships. They are all acts of war. And I think it becomes important when we talk about the disappearing of people. Look no further than when you lose 300,000 folks in 20 years. Right, and now when we ask those questions, the answers are often horrible. Right? So let me stop there. Thank y'all again for having me, rocking with me for a second. Hopefully this is making sense. And if you see me walking down Taylor, Harrison, or Halsted looking like I'm in the flux, I probably am. Right? So thank y'all again. So what we wanted to do was, because I know you all have an evening plan, but what we wanted to do was open it up for questions to kind of engage this. And let me say, these questions are extremely useful for me because it's allowing me to think about how to approach this. Like I have a bunch of preliminary ideas, but I've been talking with folks becomes important. And let me check. Does this mess with you if I sit down?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. They just wanted to make a space where we can engage or have a staring contest. Whichever one suits folks, right?
And we don't have a microphone, so you just got to stand up and be loud. Great.
Mm-hmm.
What roles do organizations like BAM and like youth guidance play within supporting this and also like creating some conflict as well?
Right. So this idea, so people are unfamiliar, there's an organization called Youth Guidance that has a male-identified component and a female-identified component. The male component is called BAM. The female component is WOW. And BAM is becoming a man, and WOW.
Working on womanhood.
Say it again.
Working on womanhood.
Working on womanhood. Thank you. So when we look at these particular spaces, it's always around, and this is what I always am worried about. On the male side, it can be around the pathologizing of young people, right? And I'm always concerned about that, right? Because a lot of times when we talk about violence, we want to make it pathological, right? When it's not. Violence is conditional, right? It's based on a condition. So now when we have, and I just think about it in terms of referrals, right? So when a young person is referred to becoming a man, then they've been identified quasi as the problem, right? And is this work really around containing the problem more, right? Or is the work around saying there's a broader conversation that we need to have here, right? And is it a process that now becomes transactional, right? So the peace circle can become transactional, right? It can just be this thing that young people do when an infraction occurs, right? In opposed to saying, what is a commitment to healing and what does it look like in a school? I would argue that's a very different question, right? And it would look different because now everybody is trained on it, right? And you're no longer resting on the pathology of let's get to these folks first before something happens, right? It's back to the fear, right? We got to do something before it happens, in opposed to saying, what does it mean to commit to healing? And that's what I appreciate about Let Us Breathe. The question they ask is, what does it mean to be committed to our healing as an act of self-determination, right? Which is a different process. I'm much more familiar with BAM, because a lot of my students work in BAM, and WOW actually came quite a bit later, right? Because women identified folks were like, what are you doing, right? Because I think another component in this is that we need to understand this at the intersection of race, place, gender, age, and ability, right? And sexual orientation, right? Because bodies are queer, bodies are aged, bodies are gendered. And when we don't locate that in this space, we also miss the point, right? So I think it becomes critically important for us to think about this holistically, not as having the answers, but because this is always a thing. I'm glad you asked that, because this is always a thing around what you all are experiencing now in the rhetoric around trauma-informed care, right? We don't think about trauma, we think about trauma as an inherent pathology, in opposed to trauma as an injury, right? So if you think about trauma as an injury from a situation that you felt that you had no control over, then the process of healing is very different. You're not thinking about someone as damaged. You're thinking about someone who has experienced an injury, right? So now, what the recovery is very different, right? Because now it's rehabilitative in terms of developing strength around addressing how you responded to that particular injury, in opposed to young people being inherently traumatized. How do you know that without engaging them, right? This is a big thing, right? Because everybody got trauma-informed care. Everybody does the trauma-informed care PD. Then you go to sleep because it's some bullshit, right? And so all of these things, and I'm always saying to myself is, this is back to pathological arguments, right? And we have to be committed to interrupt that pathological argument, because we know that's not the case, right? But that injury, right? How do we understand people who have experienced an injury, right? And only certain folks are afforded that, right? And that's racialized, right? So now thinking about how we think about it, because I think that's the exact same kind of pathway. Right? In fact, I just talked to somebody this morning about some trauma-informed care, right? I was like, what do you mean by that? Right? Just like the same thing around implicit bias. Nope. The meaning of bias means that it is informed by something. There's nothing implicit about it. You got to ask what informs the bias. And everybody's like, got an implicit bias training. Right? I mean, like that thing around it, because I mean, it just, like, it goes right back to that same old trope, right? And it's really around saying, we have to think about this differently. We think about it differently. Our practices are different. Thank you, Phil. Mm-hmm.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for your time and laying all of this out. And I think that the idea and the way that you talk about engineered conflict is so key and it's so important, especially when you bring in the idea of Black fugitive futures, because it kind of changes the way that works. And so when I think about all of these things collectively based on like the devaluing of Black lives, right? And then now the creation of these new systems to reject that idea. Those new systems still have to be created to combat the current system that is in place. So have you
thank you so much for that question, because I think this is where we have to go. And I have to confess to you all, I had so back, I started off, and I still do work around critical race theory, right? So critical race theory is the understanding that racism is endemic to life in the United States. It's foundational. Racism is foundational to life in the United States. And I used to get in a battle with all these structuralists, right? Stovall, this is a question of capital, right? I was like, all right, right? But as I started to look at this more, and and living it, we also are up against all the time the contradictions of capital, right? And what I mean by that, so Black feminist workers through an organization called Insight, Color of Violence, they produced a book about 10 years ago called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And they refer to it as the nonprofit industrial complex. And this is always this contention, right, in terms of, exactly to your point, because you're up against this, like this thing is happening in the world, right? You're not going off into this other place to create it, right? You're doing this in Chicago amongst those heavy contentions that we're living. So now, one of those contentions is always this question of capital, right? How is this supported, right? What do we actually do to support it, right? Does this become another grant-driven project, right? I mean, like, because and that's a contradiction of capital, right? That's that thing is saying that capital operates as this totalizing system. And in that totalizing system, you are always in terms of asking some question around how you navigate it, not necessarily how you end it, right? And that's always the contention, right? Because what we're really talking about is working with folks who have been deemed surplus. I'm actually saying this out loud. Karl Marx had a point, shit, right? But this thing around Karl Marx had a point, but we really need to read Cedric Robinson, who talks about how capitalism is racialized, right? So capitalism is a racial invention also, not just an invention of exploitation, right? So this thing around, when we start to think about that, that's that place where we're pressed up against that contradiction in real time, right? Because now we have to figure that out in terms of how we navigate that, and let us read, they had a very interesting approach to this, right? Because they didn't have a grant space. It was literally somebody who rented them out of space for cheap, that they just kind of pulled together money. I mean, straight up rent parties, right? Folks who are old enough to remember rent parties, right? That people just got up dough and said, all right, here's what we're gonna do, right? Here's to pay our rent for this little bit of space, right? And then everything else we're gonna do, we're not even engage in money. But there's also another interesting piece to this. And I've been thinking about this. So when Black workers came north, particularly to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York City, they created this very interesting bartering network between each other that didn't involve money.